The morning Amos Townsend finally crossed the Calloway River. The water was the highest it had ever been in the memory of any living soul in Harlan County, Texas, and the woman on the other side was screaming for her life. But we ought to start 7 years before that morning, when the river was low and clear and hardly more than a whisper between two pieces of land. And Amos Townsend was 23 years old with sun-cracked lips and a heart full of something he could not name. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Crossfield sat on the western bank of the Calloway River like a man resting against a fence post, comfortable, unhurried, and a little rough around the edges. Crossfield had a general store, a livery stable, a church with a listing steeple, a saloon that did more business than the church, and a sheriff named Harold Prout who had once shot a rattlesnake out of the air mid-strike and never let anyone forget it. The eastern bank of the river belonged to the Bell family and had for 3 generations. Their property was called Bell Crossing, a name the locals had given it simply because the Bell family had always been the ones willing to ford that particular stretch of river. The Bell farm sat on 40 acres of good bottomland, where cotton and corn grew in alternating rows, and a grove of pecan trees shaded the eastern yard. Amos worked at the livery on the Crossfield side. He was not a man of grand ambitions in those early years. He had come to Crossfield from San Antonio following the death of his father, carrying a bedroll, a good horse, and very little else. He had gotten the livery job from old Pete Wharton, who needed someone who understood horses and didn't mind the smell, and Amos qualified on both counts. He was lean and quiet, with dark eyes that had a habit of drifting toward the eastern bank of the river whenever he walked to the edge of Crossfield's single main road. That was how he first saw Theresa Bell. She had been 19 then, a year younger than the century itself, with dark hair the color of river mud after rain and eyes that were green as new spring wheat. He had been standing outside the livery on a Tuesday morning in April, watching a wagon cross the ford at the shallow bend a quarter-mile north of town, when she had come riding a sorrel mare at a pace that suggested she was either late or simply preferred speed for the joy of it. She had crossed through the shallow ford without slowing much, water spraying up around the mare's legs in bright arcs in the morning sun, and she had laughed at the sensation of it. He had heard that laugh from 40 yards away. It was the kind of laugh that made a man look up from whatever he was doing. She had ridden into Crossfield to pick up a crate of dry goods from the general store, and Amos had watched her tie the sorrel to the hitching post with the efficient confidence of someone who had been doing it since childhood. She wore a practical cotton dress, and her hair was braided and pinned, though a few pieces had come loose in the wind of her riding. She had looked around the street with those green eyes, taking stock of the town the way a person takes stock of a room they have walked into many times but still find worth examining, and then she had gone into the store. Amos had gone back to work. But he had not stopped thinking about her laugh. He learned her name from Pete Wharton, who knew everyone's business and was happy to share it. Theresa Bell, Pete had said, daughter of Franklin Bell and his late wife Margaret, who had died of a fever when Theresa was 12. Theresa kept house for her father and her older brother Caleb, who was 24 and ran the farming operation with the kind of intensity that came from having too much to do and not enough help. There was also a younger sister, Clara, who was 15 and reportedly spent more time reading than working, which Pete said with the particular disapproval of a man who had never read a book in his life. In those first years, Amos would see Theresa perhaps once or twice a month, when she crossed the ford to come into Crossfield for supplies. Sometimes she came alone on her mare. Sometimes she brought Clara in the wagon. Occasionally Caleb came with her, a broad-shouldered man with their father's coloring and a manner that was not unfriendly but was not particularly warm either. Amos always found some reason to be near the street when the Bell wagon was in town. He was not, he told himself, loitering. He was simply a man who liked fresh air. He spoke to her for the first time 3 months after he first saw her, and it came about because of a loose wagon wheel. She had been loading the Bell wagon with the dry goods crate and a sack of flour when the right rear wheel had come loose in a way that made the whole wagon list sharply to one side. The flour sack had nearly slid off, and she had caught it with both arms, but the crate had not been so lucky and had hit the dirt of the main road with a crack that suggested the jar of molasses inside was having a difficult day. Amos had been across the street and had seen it happen, and had crossed without making a conscious decision to do so. He had pulled the wagon wheel back into alignment with the axle, found that the linchpin had worked itself almost entirely out, replaced it with one from the small supply he kept in his vest pocket, because Pete Wharton had always said a man who worked with wagons ought to carry a spare, and then he had stood up and found Theresa Bell looking at him with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and appraisal. "Thank you," she had said. "That would have been a miserable drive home." "Yes, ma'am," he had said, and then, because he had been rehearsing things to say to her in the casual theater of his own mind for 3 months and had now forgotten all of them, he had said nothing else. She had looked at him a moment longer and then she had smiled. "You work at the livery, don't you? I've seen you." "Yes, ma'am, Amos Townsend." "Theresa Bell," she had said, as though he might not know, and held out her hand. He had shaken it, feeling the calluses on her palm that came from farm work, and had thought they were the most interesting calluses he had ever encountered. "You're careful with that wheel from here on," he had told her, which was the most useful thing he could think to say, and she had nodded with the gravity of someone receiving good advice. And then she had driven the wagon home across the ford, and he had watched until she was out of sight. That had been 7 years ago, or near enough to 7 years that Amos had stopped counting the days with any precision. 7 years of watching her come and go across that river. 7 years of brief conversations at the general store, at the church when she came to the Sunday services in Crossfield rather than the smaller congregation on the eastern side, at the occasional community gathering when both sides of the river mixed together for a barn raising or a harvest celebration. 7 years of knowing Theresa Bell well enough to know she liked strong coffee and was irritated by men who underestimated her capacity for physical work and had a habit of whistling while she tied things down, and not well enough to say any of the things that accumulated in him like water behind a dam whenever she turned those green eyes on him. There were reasons he had not crossed that river with his intentions plain. In the early years, he had not had enough to offer. He was a livery hand with no land of his own, and Theresa Bell was from a farming family with roots in that soil, and he had felt the distance between their circumstances like a physical thing. Then Pete Wharton had died in the winter of 1880, and had left the livery to Amos in his will because, as Pete had written in a letter left with the lawyer, Amos was the only person he had ever met who loved horses more than profit, and Pete had considered that a sign of good character. So Amos had become the owner of Wharton's livery, which he renamed simply Townsend Livery, and he had begun to save money with the focused determination of a man building towards something, even if he had not allowed himself to name that something out loud. And then in 1882, there had been a man named Edward Colton, who had come to the Crossfield area from Kansas City with money and a fine coat, and a manner that suggested he considered charm to be a tool rather than a quality. Edward Colton had spent 6 months courting Theresa Bell with the systematic precision of a man who had decided he wanted a particular piece of land and was working toward acquiring it by the most direct route. There had been 3 months of Amos watching Edward Colton cross the ford to call on Theresa, and those had been the 3 longest months of Amos Townsend's life. It had ended badly, which Amos had known it would but had not been able to tell anyone without revealing things about himself he was not prepared to reveal. Caleb Bell had been the one to find out that Edward Colton already had a wife in Kansas City, left behind for reasons that became clearer when his financial situation turned out to be considerably less stable than his coat suggested. Colton had left Crossfield on a night in December 1882 with a bruised jaw courtesy of Calloway Bell, and a reputation that preceded him wherever the Crossfield gossip network could reach, which was, it turned out, quite far. After Colton, Theresa had been noticeably quieter on her visits to town. Not sad, exactly, but watchful, as though she had revised her estimate of people's intentions and was now applying more scrutiny before accepting anything at face value. Amos had respected that watchfulness even as it presented a new kind of obstacle. The years between 1883 and 1885 had passed in a rhythm that was comfortable if not particularly forward-moving. Amos had expanded the livery, adding a small farrier operation and a wagon repair service that kept him busy from sunup to well past dark most days. The town of Crossfield had grown somewhat, a new family arriving every season or so, drawn by the land availability and the relative stability of the area. The Bell farm on the eastern side had continued to produce steadily, though Amos had heard from various sources that Franklin Bell's health was declining, that the old man's chest was bad in the winters. Then in 1884, Clara Bell, who had spent all those years reading, had married a schoolteacher from Lubbock named Henry Marsh, and had moved north with him. Theresa had taken the departure hard, or so it seemed to Amos, because for months after Clara left, she had come into Crossfield with a quiet around her that was different from her usual contained self-sufficiency. Amos had found ways to extend their brief conversations. He had asked about her father's health, about the farm, about whether she had heard from Clara. These were not the conversations he wanted to have with her, but they were the ones available to him, and he had taken them gratefully. By 1885, Amos Townsend was 30 years old and owned a profitable livery stable, and had enough money saved to buy land if he chose to. And he had not said one single word to Theresa Bell about the fact that he thought about her every day and had done so for 6 years. He had come close, in the summer of that year, at a harvest gathering on the Crossfield side of the river. They had been standing near the dessert table while a fiddler played something fast and cheerful, and she had been laughing at something old Mrs. Patterson had said, and the lamplight from the lantern strung overhead had caught the green of her eyes and made them look like river water in sunlight, and Amos had opened his mouth. And then Calloway Bell had appeared at her elbow to tell her that their father had taken a turn, and they needed to get home, and Amos had swallowed whatever he had been about to say, and he had watched them go, and the moment had passed like all the others. Franklin Bell had died in November of 1885. He had lasted 2 more weeks after that harvest gathering scare, long enough to see his cotton in and to sit in his chair by the window and look at the river, and then he had gone quietly in his sleep, which everyone agreed was a mercy for a man who had worked hard all his life. After that, Calloway Bell had run the farm alone, because Calloway had never married and apparently did not plan to. And Theresa had stayed, because there was no reason for her to leave and every reason to stay, and because Theresa Bell was not the kind of woman who walked away from something that needed doing. And so the years had continued to go by, and Amos Townsend had continued to love her from across the Calloway River, and the river had continued to flow between them as indifferent and unhurried as time itself, until the spring of 1885 became 1886, and then 1887, and the spring of 1885 had become the spring of 1885, and there was now a spring of a different kind coming, the kind the old-timers called a wet year, which meant trouble. It had started in February of 1885. No, not 1885. It was now the spring of 1885, let us be precise. It was April of 1885, and Amos Townsend was 30 years old, and the rain that had started in February had not truly stopped in 2 months. The Calloway River, which in dry years barely covered a horse's hocks at the ford, had been rising steadily since March. By the first week of April it was running bank to bank, brown and fast, with a voice that you could hear from the Crossfield main road if the wind was right. By the second week, the ford was impassable and had been for days. The rain fell every day. Not always hard, but persistently, in the way that a persistent thing is sometimes worse than a dramatic one. The sky had taken on a uniform gray character and showed no signs of reconsidering. The creeks that fed into the Calloway were running full, and the river was receiving all of it. Amos had been watching the eastern bank with increasing frequency and increasing concern. From the edge of the Crossfield road, which stood on a slight rise above the river, he could see the Bell farm clearly on its bottomland, and what he saw was worrying. The farm sat lower than the surrounding terrain, good for moisture in dry years, catastrophic in wet ones. The river had already begun to spread across the Bell fields in a wide, dark sheet that moved slowly and relentlessly toward the farmhouse. He had seen Caleb and Theresa moving sandbags 2 days ago, small figures against the gray sky, working with the urgency of people who understood what was coming. The problem was the ford. The ford was well and truly gone, replaced by a stretch of river that was now perhaps 300 yards across, and moving with a current that would knock a horse off its feet. The only other crossing was the Hartley Bridge, 6 miles north, and if the reports coming down from that direction were accurate, the bridge was in danger too. Amos had been building a raft since the previous day. He had not told anyone what it was for. The men at the Crossfield saloon had been discussing the flood with the enthusiastic concern of people who were not in immediate danger of it, and several opinions had been offered about the Bell farm and its prospects, and none of the opinionated men had offered to do anything about it. Sheriff Prout had sent word that the county was aware of the situation and was monitoring it, which meant nothing was going to happen quickly. Amos Townsend was not a man who waited on institutions when something needed doing. He had the raft mostly completed by the morning of April 14th, 1885, which was the morning the situation changed from urgent to critical. He was at the river's edge before sunrise, checking the lashings on the raft by the light of a lantern when he heard it. The scream carried across the water with a clarity that cut through the sound of the rain and the rushing river like a knife through cloth. It was a woman's voice, and even at that distance, even distorted by water and wind, he knew it. He was on the raft before the echo of it had finished. The raft was not elegant. It was 8 logs, cut from the dead timber he had accumulated behind the livery, lashed together with every rope he had on hand, and a few he had borrowed without asking from the livery's supply room. He had a long pole for pushing and steering, and he had tied the raft to a line that was staked to the bank, planning to use it as a guide and a way to pull himself back. The line was only long enough to get him halfway across, though, and he had known that from the start and had decided it would have to be enough of a start. The current was far stronger than he had anticipated. The moment the raft left the bank, it was seized by the river and swung downstream, and he jammed the pole into the riverbed and pushed with everything he had, using the current's energy the way a man might use the strength of something fighting against him, angling the raft rather than fighting directly. The rope went taut and held. He was perhaps 150 yards out, the water dark and moving around him, when a second sound came from the eastern bank, and this time it was not a scream but a voice calling his name. Amos, Amos Townsend. He looked up through the rain. On the eastern bank, standing at the edge of where solid ground gave way to the spreading floodwater, was Theresa Bell. She was soaked through, her dark hair loose and plastered to her face and shoulders. She was standing in water up to her knees, even on what should have been high ground, and she was holding a lantern that somehow was still burning, the flame a fierce little point of gold against the gray morning. He had never heard her say his name like that before. He had heard his name from her in casual greeting, in the practical exchange of conversation. He had never heard it said the way you say something you have been holding. "I'm coming," he shouted back and bent to the pole. Getting the raft across the remaining distance without the guide rope was a matter of physics and stubbornness. He lost the raft's forward position twice to the current and had to correct by pushing hard off a partially submerged willow tree that was now standing in 8 feet of water. The pole was 12 feet long and in some places barely reached the bottom. Once, the raft tilted sharply when the current caught it broadside and he nearly went into the water, catching himself by dropping to his knees and shifting his weight in a way that was mostly instinct. He was drenched from the first minute. His hands were bleeding from a rope burn he hadn't noticed acquiring. When the raft finally ground against the submerged earth of the eastern bank, Theresa Bell was 10 feet away, and she was crying, which was the first time in 7 years of watching her that he had ever seen her cry. He stepped off the raft into knee-deep water and came to her, and she grabbed his arm with both hands, and what she said was, "Caleb. He went to move the horses to higher ground last night and he hasn't come back. I can't get to the barn. The water is too deep between here and there, and I can hear the horses." Amos looked in the direction she was pointing. Through the rain and the gray light, he could see the roofline of the Bell barn perhaps 200 yards further along the submerged ground. The barn sat on slightly higher ground than the farmhouse, which was why Caleb would have gone there, but between the farmhouse and the barn the land dipped, and that dip was now entirely under water. "How long has he been gone?" Amos asked. "Since last night, just after dark." Her hands were still on his arm and she was looking at him with those green eyes full of fear and something else he did not have time to examine. "I tried to wade out but the current knocked me down. I lost my footing and I had to come back." "Is the house solid?" "For now, but the water's still rising." "All right," he said. "You stay here on high ground. I'm going to go find Caleb." "Amos, I have a raft," he said, which was the most reassuring thing he could think to tell her, and he went back to the raft and pushed it through the water in the direction of the barn, using the pole to keep it from being swept sideways. The water between the farmhouse and the barn was moving but not racing, gathered in a kind of broad shallow lake across the Bell fields. He could hear the horses before he reached the barn, their voices high and frightened, and when he pushed the raft up to the barn's upper doors, which were accessible now because the water had risen enough to make them the ground floor, he found Caleb Bell inside. Caleb was alive. He had broken his left leg sometime in the night, likely from a fall in the dark water, and had managed to drag himself up onto the beam storage platform at the top of the barn, which was dry or nearly so. He was conscious and pale, with the set expression of a man who had been in pain for many hours and had made his peace with it. "Townsend," Caleb said, with no particular surprise, as though Amos arriving on a raft in the middle of a flood was a reasonable thing to expect. "My leg's gone." "I can see that," Amos said. "Can you get onto this raft?" "I can get onto damn near anything if the option is drowning," Caleb said. Getting Caleb Bell onto the raft was an exercise in controlled difficulty. The man was big, and his leg was badly broken, the kind of break that had to be kept still or risk doing worse damage, and the raft was not designed for a passenger. Amos improvised a splint from a short length of board he found on the barn's platform, lashed it with his belt and a length of harness leather that hung on the wall, and then between them they managed to get Caleb positioned on the raft on his back, holding onto the sides. The horses. Amos looked at them. There were 3, 2 of them saddle horses and one the big draft animal the farm used for plowing. They were standing in chest-deep water on the lower barn level, wide-eyed and trembling. He couldn't take them on the raft, but he could give them a chance. He opened the barn's upper doors fully and then waded down to the lower level, which meant going into the water himself, and unlatched every stall door. The draft horse found its footing first, pushed through the open door and began swimming. The other 2 followed. They would swim to high ground if there was any to find, and the land to the north was higher. He had to believe they would make it. Then he got back on the raft with Caleb Bell and pushed for the farmhouse. Theresa was waiting where he had left her, still holding her lantern. When she saw Caleb, she made a sound that was not quite a word, just a sound of relief so pure it had no language adequate to it, and she waded out to the raft's edge. "He's got a broken leg," Amos said. "Bad break, but clean. He needs a doctor." "Dr. Haverson is in Crossfield," she said. "I know, but we can't cross the river with him on this raft, not with the current as it is." Amos looked at the farmhouse. "Can he be moved inside?" "Yes, the house is holding. Come on." Getting Caleb Bell into the farmhouse, up the 2 front steps that were now barely above water level, through the door and onto the front room settle was a joint effort. Theresa was stronger than she looked, which Amos had suspected but now confirmed absolutely. She took her brother's upper body without being asked, instructing him clearly on how to hold the broken leg, and they moved him in a slow and careful operation that Caleb endured with remarkable stoicism, only hissing once when the leg shifted. They got him onto the settle. Theresa had quilts out and had his leg properly cushioned inside of 5 minutes, working with the competent speed of someone who had spent years taking care of things that needed doing. Amos stood in the doorway of the Bell farmhouse and watched her, and felt the 7 years of watching from across the river converge on this moment like all those rain-swollen creeks converging on the Calloway. The house was solid. It was old wood but good wood, built by Franklin Bell's own father and maintained carefully. The water outside was lapping at the top step now, but the floor inside was still dry. Theresa had moved everything she could off the lower shelves and had filled every container she owned with clean water before the flood reached the well. The kitchen was organized with the emergency efficiency of a woman who had seen her father handle crises and had learned from watching. Amos stayed because it made no sense to go. The river was higher now than when he had crossed, and the raft's single return trip with Caleb was out of the question until conditions improved. He told himself, being practical. He was also, he did not say to himself, not going anywhere near that river as long as Theresa Bell was in this house. The day passed in the strange, suspended way of emergencies, where time moves both very fast and very slowly depending on what is happening. Amos checked the water level every hour, cutting a mark on the exterior doorframe each time to track the rise. At noon it was still rising, though more slowly. By mid-afternoon it had stopped. By evening it had receded 3 inches. In between checking the water, he helped with the farmhouse. He found where the root cellar door was showing a trickle of water coming through and packed the gap with rags and clay. He got up on the roof with a rope tied around his waist and checked the chimney, which was clear. He brought in extra wood from the porch woodpile while it was still accessible. He was not a man who could be idle when there was work to be done, and the Bell farm offered work in every direction. Theresa made coffee, which she had been protecting from the flood with the determination of a woman who understood that coffee was not a luxury in a situation like this, but a necessity for both warmth and clear thinking. She brought him a cup while he was checking Caleb's leg again, and when he looked up she was watching him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. "You came across in this flood," she said. Not a question. Not gratitude exactly, though there was that in it. More like she was saying something out loud that she was still working out the implications of. "Your raft was ready," he said, which was true and also not what she had said. "You built a raft," she said. "I'd been building it since yesterday." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him over the top of her coffee cup. Why? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He was 30 years old, and he had been considering how to answer a version of this question for 7 years, and the flood and the distance and the 7 years of waiting had burned away most of his reserve. "Because I could see the water rising from the Crossfield bank," he said, "and there are people on this side of the river that matter to me." She held his gaze for a long moment. The lamplight was amber in the room, the sound of the rain on the roof a steady percussion, Caleb's breathing on the settle slow, and even because Theresa had given him half a bottle of laudanum she had in the medicine cabinet, enough to keep the pain manageable and encourage sleep. "People," she said. "One person," he said. "Particularly." Another long moment. Something moved through her expression, something that had been pressed down a long time coming up toward the surface. "I have wondered," she said very quietly, "for several years whether I was imagining things." "You were not imagining things," he said. She let out a slow breath. "Amos Townsend," she said, and it had the same quality as when she had called his name across the water that morning, something held and then released. "7 years is a very long time to wonder." "I know it," he said. "I am sorry for the time. I was working up to it in stages, and the stages took longer than I intended." A small smile crossed her face, the kind that had a depth of amusement behind it. "You built a raft to cross a flood," she said, "but you could not walk across a dry ford to call on me." "The flood was simpler," he said. She laughed. Not the bright, carefree laugh he had heard from 40 yards away 7 years ago, but something fuller and more complex, and it was better. She set her coffee cup down on the kitchen table and she looked at him. And in the lamplight of the Bell farmhouse, with the flood water receding outside and her brother asleep on the settle, and 7 years of watching and wondering collapsed into this one wet, disheveled, extraordinary evening, Theresa Bell said, "Well, now that you've crossed, I suppose you had better stay a while." "I had intended to," he said. The night came down around the farmhouse and the flood continued its slow retreat. Amos slept in the chair by the kitchen fire because there was nowhere else appropriate to sleep, and he was practical about such things, waking every few hours to check the water level and keep the fire going. Theresa slept in her room but left her door open because of Caleb, and once in the night when Caleb stirred and made a sound she was up before Amos had fully risen, already at her brother's side, talking quietly to him, her voice steady and reassuring in the dark. Amos watched her from the kitchen and thought that he had been watching her for 7 years, and it was still not enough. By the morning of April 15th, the flood had receded enough that the Bell fields were visible again, the furrows thick with deposited river mud that would make the soil extraordinarily rich for planting if the season cooperated. The farmhouse sat on its ground with its dignity intact, though the lower yard was a wreck of mud and scattered debris. The barn had held. 2 of the horses had returned to the high ground behind the barn on their own, the draft horse and one of the saddle horses. The third, a bay mare, was found the following week at a farm 6 miles north, none the worse for her adventure. Getting Caleb Bell to Dr. Haverson was accomplished on the afternoon of April 15th, when the ford had receded to a passable state, very rough and still running high but crossable for a careful man with a sturdy horse. Amos went across first to fetch the wagon and Doc Haverson, and Haverson came back with him and crossed the ford in the wagon without particular complaint, which Amos thought said something about the caliber of country doctors. Haverson set Caleb's leg properly on the kitchen table with Theresa holding the lamp and Amos holding Caleb's shoulders, and he said it would be a long recovery, 6 weeks at least before any weight could be put on it, and that Caleb Bell had the constitution of a particularly stubborn piece of local oak, which he said as a compliment. Amos came back to the Bell farm every day for the next week. He told himself the first few times that he was coming to help with the things that Caleb could not do, which was true and also convenient. The flood damage was extensive and required constant work. The fences needed checking and repairing where the water had taken posts and wire. The field furrows needed clearing of debris before planting could begin. The root cellar needed mucking out and drying. The chicken coop had taken on water and needed repairs before the chickens, which had spent the flood on a platform in the barn loft and were now expressing their resentment loudly, could be returned to it. Theresa accepted his help with grace and without making it into something fraught. She was not a woman who played games with gratitude or obligation, and she did not pretend she did not need the help when she clearly did. She also did not pretend, after that first evening's conversation, that his presence was purely agricultural. On the third day, while they were working side by side to clear debris from the south field, she said, without looking up from what she was doing, "When my father was alive, he used to say that the Crossfield boys were good for looking at and not much else. He wasn't talking about you specifically, but I always thought it applied. Amos stopped working and looked at her. Your father never spoke to me more than twice. He watched how you handled horses, she said. He said a man who is kind to horses is either very good or very good at pretending. She glanced up at him. He thought you were the first kind. What did you think? He asked. She straightened up and looked at him directly, the sun behind her making her hair into something luminous despite its practical braid. I thought you took a very long time to say anything worth hearing. I'm saying things now, he pointed out. Yes, she said with that same deep current smile. You are. The courtship, if that was the word for it, had a different character from most courtships Amos had observed, because they were not starting from nothing. They already knew each other in the way of people who have been in near proximity for years, who have watched each other's public selves and drawn conclusions. What they were doing now was filling in the interior, saying the things that 7 years of careful constraint had kept unspoken. He told her about his father, who had been a tanner in San Antonio, a quiet man with large hands who had loved his son with the inarticulate ferocity common to men who don't know how to speak their love but would do anything to prove it. His father had died of cholera in the winter of 1877, alone in his tannery because the neighbors had been too frightened of contagion to come near, and Amos had arrived from the cattle drive. He had been working too late by 3 days. He had been carrying that 3-day lateness for 8 years. She told him about her mother, Margaret Bell, who had died of the fever when Theresa was 12, and who had been, by all accounts, a woman of extraordinary practical intelligence and no patience whatsoever for weakness of character. Her mother had taught her to ride, to cook, to read, and to refuse to be diminished in that approximate order. She had been 12 when her mother died, and the grief had been enormous and clean. The way grief is when you are young and do not yet have the complications of adult regret to fold into it. She told him about Edward Colton, with a directness that suggested she had thought about what she wanted to say on that subject, and wanted him to know she had processed it. She said she had not been in love with him, had been more in love with the idea of a future that wasn't entirely defined by the Bell farm and the eastern bank of the Calloway, and that she had known for months before Caleb found out about the wife that something was wrong. She had been ignoring what she knew, she said, because she had not been certain she was right, and because ignoring unpleasant certainties had been easier than confronting them. She had learned from that, she said. She was now a woman who confronted unpleasant certainties directly. Is that what you're doing with me? He asked. Confronting certainties. She looked at him over the supper table, which had become a natural place for these conversations because they were both practical people who found it efficient to eat and talk at the same time. Caleb was asleep in his room. The kitchen was warm. You, she said, are not an unpleasant certainty. He felt something open in his chest that had been closed a long time. On the 8th day, he kissed her. It happened at the end of the workday, in the late April light that falls in Texas like honey poured slow, when they were standing at the gate of the repaired chicken yard, and the air smelled like wet earth and growing things, and the Calloway, which was still high but falling daily. He had been looking at her in profile, at the particular line of her jaw and the way she had a habit of pressing her lips together when she was assessing something, and the combination of everything, the 7 years and the flood and the 8 days and the things said over the supper table, had consolidated into a simple and irresistible conclusion. He said her name. She turned to look at him. And he kissed her slowly and carefully, the way you approach something you have been careful about for a long time and are now finally allowing yourself to have. She kissed him back with a forthright warmth that he should not have been surprised by, given everything he knew about her character, but which surprised him anyway in the best possible way. 7 years, she said, when they stepped back from each other, and he could not tell if it was a statement of complaint or of wonder, possibly both. I'm hoping to make up for some of the lost time, he said. You had better get started then, she said, and reached up to straighten his collar with both hands in the manner of a woman who has decided something and sees no reason to delay the implementation of it. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in early May, 3 weeks after the flood, in the front room of the Bell farmhouse, with Caleb Bell sitting in a chair with his broken leg propped on a stool and looking on with an expression that was the particular expression of a big brother who has known something was coming and is mildly gratified to be proven right. It was not an elaborate proposal. Amos was not a man given to flourishes. He told her that he had loved her for 7 years from across the river, and he intended to love her for the rest of his life from considerably closer range, and that he would like her to be his wife if she was willing to have him. He said he had a business and a savings and the intention to buy land, and that none of that was the point. The point was that he wanted to be in the same life as her, the same house and the same days and the same conversations, and that he had wanted this long enough to be absolutely certain it was not a temporary feeling. Theresa Bell listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes steady on his face, and then she said, "Yes." Amos Townsend, yes. Obviously, yes. Obviously, Caleb Bell said from his chair, and then held out his hand to shake Amos's, which Amos did with something in his chest that felt like a river after rain, very full and very fast and carrying everything. They were married in June of 1885 at the Crossfield church on a day that was clear and warm and smelled of the river and blooming things. The church was full because both sides of the Calloway had people who wanted to see it, which was perhaps not entirely about Amos and Theresa, and partly about the fact that the flood of April and its aftermath had become one of those stories. A small community tells itself about itself. The kind of story with a hero and a rescue and a romance. The kind of story that becomes part of the tissue of the place. Theresa wore a dress she and Mrs. Patterson had made together from fabric ordered from a catalog out of Dallas, white cotton with a blue ribbon at the waist, because she said she was not going to stand in front of a congregation in a dress that did not have something of color in it. Her hair was up in a way that was more elaborate than her usual braid, pinned with small combs that had belonged to her mother. She walked up the aisle of the church with Caleb Bell, who had graduated to a cane, and walked with only a slight unevenness, and she looked at Amos when she saw him at the front of the church with an expression that was so entirely unguarded that several women in the congregation pressed handkerchiefs to their faces. Amos Townsend, who was not given to flourishes, was wearing a clean suit and had had his hair cut by the Crossfield barber that morning. And when Theresa came up beside him, he turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was the one that had been building for 7 years, simply and completely present, no longer held in reserve. The minister, Reverend Holloway, kept his remarks brief, which everyone appreciated. The vows were the traditional ones, the words worn smooth with use, but holding their weight the way old wood holds weight better than new wood. When Amos said the words, he said them like he meant each one individually, which he did. After the ceremony, the town of Crossfield celebrated with the particular enthusiasm of a community that does not get enough celebrations and intends to make the most of available ones. There was food from approximately every household on both sides of the river, a fiddler and a guitarist who played until they were hoarse, and dancing that went until the stars came out. Theresa danced with her husband 3 times and with Caleb twice, and with every other person who asked her, and laughed with the full-throated freedom of a woman who has arrived somewhere she has been meaning to arrive for a long time. Amos danced twice, which was his limit, and then watched from the edge of the celebration because watching Theresa Bell happy was one of his preferred activities, and he was not going to apologize for it. The question of where they would live had been settled practically and without drama. Amos's apartment above the livery was not a home for a married couple, and he had been intending to buy land. The Bell farm on the eastern side had Caleb, who could not work it properly alone with a leg still healing, and it had 40 acres of good bottomland and a solid house with a root cellar and a barn. Amos sold his apartment and bought into the Bell farm, not in a way that displaced Caleb or diminished what the Bell family had built, but as a true partnership, his savings going into improvements and equipment, his labor going into the fields and the animals, his name added to the property deed alongside Caleb's and Theresa's. He kept the livery. He hired a young man named Tom Whitfield, 19 years old and good with horses, to run the daily operations, and he went in 3 days a week to manage the business side. It was enough to keep it profitable, and not so much that it kept him from the farm. The first summer of their marriage was the kind of summer that becomes a reference point. That thing you look back on and say that was when things were good. That was the measure. The flood damage had left the Bell fields extraordinarily fertile, as Amos had predicted, and the cotton that went in that spring came up strong and thick, and the harvest in September was the best the Bell farm had produced in a decade. The money from the harvest went into a new roof for the barn and a larger kitchen garden, and a colt that Amos bought at a sale in Lubbock and named Crossing, which he said was because of the ford, and which Theresa said was because he was sentimental, and which he did not deny. Clara came down from Lubbock with her husband Henry Marsh for the harvest and stayed 2 weeks, and the farmhouse was full of voices and cooking smells, and the particular domestic warmth of people who have not been together for a long time and are making up for it. Clara and Theresa stayed up late talking, and Amos and Henry Marsh sat on the porch and talked about land prices, and the school Henry was teaching at, and the railroad that was supposedly coming through the area within the next few years, which would change things considerably if it did. Caleb Bell had fully recovered from his broken leg by September, walking without the cane and working at his full capacity, which was considerable. He was not a demonstrative man, but he had, in the months since the wedding, developed a habit of addressing Amos as though he were a fact of the landscape, the way you speak to something that has always been there, which Amos recognized as the highest compliment Caleb Bell was capable of giving. The autumn of 1885 was generous and long, the kind of Texas fall where the heat releases slowly, and the evenings go golden for weeks before the first frost. Amos and Theresa fell into the rhythms of a shared life, with the naturalness of people who have been preparing for exactly this life without knowing it. They worked alongside each other in the fields, and the house without the friction of adjustment that new marriages often carry, because they had already spent so many years in a kind of parallel preparation, each becoming the person the other needed, though neither had known they were doing it. In the evenings, after supper, they sat on the porch of the Bell farmhouse and watched the Calloway River in the distance, catching the last light. The river was back to its usual self, clear and unhurried at the ford, making the sound it made in the evenings, a low and steady conversation with its banks. From the porch you could see the Crossfield road on the other side and occasionally a light moving along it. 7 years, Theresa said one evening looking at the river. They had been married 4 months and the autumn was turning toward winter, the pecan trees dropping their nuts in the eastern yard. "Don't start," Amos said, with no real heat in it. "I'm not criticizing," she said. "I'm thinking about the river, how it looks the same. We're on the same bank now and it looks the same as it did from the other side. What did you think it would look like from here?" She considered this with genuine seriousness. "I don't know, different maybe, but it's just the river." "Just the river," he agreed. She leaned against him on the porch bench, the way she had taken to doing, fitting herself against his side with the unself-conscious ease of familiarity. He put his arm around her. The evening was cool and quiet and the river moved in the distance. "I'm glad you built that raft," she said. "I'm glad the flood happened," he said, and then, because that required context, added, "Not for Caleb's leg, but for the rest of it." "No," she agreed. "Not for Caleb's leg," a pause. "Though if his leg hadn't broken he might have told you to take your raft back to Crossfield." "He might," Amos said. "He's a man of strong opinions about who comes on his property." "Our property," she said. The word settled between them like something put in its proper place. "Our property," he agreed. In the winter of 1885, which was mild and quiet, Amos began building the addition to the Bell farmhouse. It was not that the existing house was insufficient, but it was a house built for a different family's size and configuration, and Amos wanted to add to it, not to change what it was but to extend it in a way that made room for the future. He and Caleb worked on it through the winter months, using good lumber hauled from Crossfield, and by spring it was complete. 2 new rooms on the north side, a larger bedroom for Amos and Theresa, and a second room that was, for the time being, a sitting room but that had been built with other possibilities in mind. Theresa saw the second room and looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at Amos with an expression that said she understood entirely what that room was built for, and she said nothing about it at the time. But 3 weeks later, in February of 1886, she told him that the room was going to be needed sooner than he might have expected. She was carrying their first child. The news moved through Amos Townsend with the quality of something that rewrites the landscape, that makes you see everything you are looking at from a new height. He sat down in the kitchen chair, not because his legs failed him, but because he needed a moment to simply be with the information before he could do anything with it. "You're sure?" he said. "Yes," she said, with the gentle certainty of a woman who had suspected for 6 weeks and was now confirmed. He looked at her across the kitchen table. This woman he had watched from across a river for 7 years. This woman who had become the center of his life as naturally as the river found its banks. He was 30 years old and she was 27, and the Bell farmhouse sat on its 40 acres of rich bottomland, and the Calloway River ran clear outside and everything ahead of them was good ground. "Well," he said, which was not the most eloquent thing he had ever said to her. "Well," she agreed, and smiled at him with the full depth of her warmth, and he came around the table to her. The pregnancy moved through the spring and summer of 1886 with the uncomplicated progress of a healthy woman doing what she had always done, which was everything that needed doing, modified in the later months by Amos's increasingly fervent requests that she not lift things heavier than the coffee pot. She had views on this request that she expressed clearly and with good humor, and they reached a compromise that satisfied neither of them entirely but was livable. Clara came back from Lubbock in August, in time for the baby, bringing with her the confidence of a woman who had been through a birth herself, Clara and Henry's son James having arrived the previous year. She and Theresa and Mrs. Patterson from Crossfield managed the birth in the Bell farmhouse's main bedroom on the 14th of September, 1886, a warm day with the smell of the harvest on the air, and Amos sat outside on the porch bench where he could hear everything, and where Caleb Bell sat beside him in the particular solidarity of a man who has no useful role in a given situation and is making his peace with that. The baby was a boy. When Clara came to the porch door and told him, Amos stood up from the bench and went inside, and when Theresa put their son in his arms, dark-haired and red-faced and making the fundamental noise of the recently arrived, Amos Townsend held him with the careful certainty of a man who understood what he was holding. "What are we calling him?" Caleb Bell asked from the doorway. "Franklin," Theresa said, from the bed, looking at Amos for confirmation. "Franklin," Amos agreed, because it was the right name, and because he understood that names carry things forward, and that Franklin Bell had been a man worth carrying forward. Franklin Townsend was a loud and determined infant who grew into a loud and determined child with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and an absolute certainty about what he wanted that made both his parents laugh even when it was inconvenient. He crawled at 6 months and walked at 11, and from the moment he could walk, he wanted to be wherever his father was, following Amos through the barn and the fields with the dedicated persistence of a small satellite. The Bell farm in the years following Franklin's birth took on the particular character of a place that is alive. Amos expanded the farming operation, adding cattle to the cotton and corn, building new fencing along the river side where the pasture ran. He and Caleb worked the land with a partnership that developed its own language over time, the kind of shorthand that comes from years of working alongside someone. Caleb Bell had taken to Amos with the reserved completeness of a man who trusts slowly but fully, and by the time Franklin was 2 years old, the two men operated the farm with the efficiency of a long-running joint enterprise. The livery in Crossfield continued to prosper under Tom Whitfield's daily management, and Amos went in twice a week, crossing the ford that was now simply part of his routine, the same crossing that had once been a metaphysical gulf, now just the way you got to town. He had bought a proper ford crossing built up with gravel and reinforced with some rough stonework on both banks, paid for out of his own pocket because he was tired of washing out every spring, and several families on both sides of the river had contributed to the work because it benefited everyone. In 1888, in March, Theresa told him she was expecting again. Franklin was a year and a half, just beginning to put words together into sentences that were recognizably ambitious if not always accurate in their grammar, and the second pregnancy moved through the summer with the same uncomplicated progress as the first. The baby came in October of 1888, a Tuesday morning when the pecans were dropping in the yard and Amos was in the south field, and had to be sent for by Tom Whitfield's younger brother, who had been dispatched from the farmhouse at a run. Amos made it back in time, barely, and their daughter was born in the bedroom with the larger windows that Amos had built, and Clara, who had brought James down from Lubbock for the occasion, was in attendance along with Mrs. Haverson, the doctor's wife, who had taken to midwifery as a natural extension of her husband's practice. They called her Margaret, for Theresa's mother. Margaret Townsend arrived in the world with a great deal more composure than her brother had, looking around the room when she was first placed on her mother's chest with an expression of studied assessment that made Theresa laugh and Amos think that she had already inherited her mother's habit of taking stock of a room. Theresa, holding her new daughter while Franklin stood on a stool beside the bed looking at his sister with an expression of provisional acceptance, looked at Amos across the room and said, "I want to sit on the porch later and watch the river." "Tonight," he said. "When I'm ready," she said. "Not too long from now. I want to watch the river and think about things." "What things?" he asked, coming to sit beside her. "Good things," she said. "Things that worked out." They sat on the porch 3 days later, in the October evening that had turned cool, Amos with Margaret against his chest and Theresa with Franklin asleep against her side, and they watched the Calloway catch the last light and carry it downstream. The river was clear and quiet and running at its autumn level, which was low enough that you could see the gravel at the ford glinting. On the Crossfield bank, the lights of the town showed warm and yellow through the trees. The livery was a dark bulk among them. Amos thought not for the first time about the man he had been on that bank, watching this farmhouse, watching this woman, carrying 7 years of something unspoken. "Are you thinking about it?" Theresa asked, which meant she was thinking about it too. "A little," he said. "Don't regret the time," she said. I don't regret it," he said. "I just think about who I was then." She leaned her head against his shoulder, careful of the sleeping baby. "Who were you then?" "A man waiting for permission to want something," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The river moved. The pecans fell in the yard with small sounds, one by one. "The flood gave you permission," she said. "The flood gave me a reason," he said. "The permission was mine to give myself. I just needed the reason." She turned her head to look at him, which was a small movement against his shoulder, but he felt the direction of it. "Then I am glad," she said, "for exactly one flood in my life." "One good flood," he agreed. In the years that followed, the Bell farm became Townsend Bell, which was what the locals called it, which was what Amos and Theresa called it, which was what the sign above the gate eventually said when Amos put a sign there in 1890, 2 planks of good cedar with the name burned into them. Caleb Bell had looked at the sign and then looked at Amos and said, without inflection, "Townsend Bell," and Amos had said, "Is that all right?" And Caleb had said, "It's accurate. which was as warm as Caleb got about naming conventions. The railroad came through in 1891, not through Crossfield exactly, but through a junction 4 miles north, which was close enough to matter. The town of Crossfield responded to the proximity of the railroad with the characteristic energy of small western towns, offered a connection to larger commerce, and in the space of 3 years Crossfield gained a proper hotel, a second general store, a newspaper, and a doctor who was there full-time rather than 3 days a week. The Bell Farm's cotton and cattle had a better route to market, and the profits from the 1891 and 1892 harvests were the best the land had seen. Amos expanded the livery to include a small freight operation, taking advantage of the junction connection. Tom Whitfield, who had proven himself over the years to be not merely reliable but genuinely excellent at business, became his partner in the freight concern, which freed Amos to spend more time on the farm. The arrangement satisfied everyone involved. Franklin Townsend, at age 6, began attending the school in Crossfield, crossing the ford every morning with his father when Amos went to the livery, and coming home in the afternoon with whoever was making the crossing. He was, by all accounts, a thorough student with a particular talent for mathematics and a habit of arguing with his teacher, Mr. Collins, on points of geography that Franklin had checked against the atlas at home and found wanting. Mr. Collins, who was a serious young man, took the arguments as a professional challenge. Theresa, when informed of the arguments, expressed no particular surprise. Margaret Townsend was a child of the farmhouse and the river bank, following her mother through the kitchen garden and the chicken yard, and the fields with the same devoted persistence that Franklin had followed Amos. She had her mother's dark hair and her grandmother's name and her father's quiet intensity, and by age 4 she was helping Theresa in ways that were genuinely helpful rather than merely supervised, holding things and carrying small loads and identifying which eggs were fresh with a seriousness that her great uncle Caleb found immensely entertaining. Caleb Bell never married. He had, over the years, shown occasional interest in the widow who ran the millinery in Crossfield, a Mrs. Evelyn Cross, and there had been a year of Sunday afternoon visits that everyone had found promising, but it had not developed into anything more, and Caleb had returned to his bachelor habits without visible distress. He was not a lonely man. He was a man who needed work and land and family near him, and he had all three in abundance. He was, in every practical sense, the children's uncle, and he discharged this role with a grave affection that manifested in teaching Franklin to throw a rope at age 4, and teaching Margaret to identify every tree on the property by leaf by age 5. In the early spring of 1893, when Franklin was 6 and Margaret was 4, Theresa told Amos she was expecting a third child. He had looked at her across the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning in March with the coffee still hot between them, and she had said it with the directness that was entirely her own. And he had felt, as he always felt with her news, that this was simply the continued arrival of something that had been growing since the beginning. The third child was another boy, born in November of 1893, and they called him James after Clara's son, which Clara received with considerable emotion when she heard it in a letter. They called him James Calvin Townsend, the Calvin for Amos's grandfather, and from the beginning he was the most even-tempered of the three, a round-faced, cheerful infant who became a round-faced, cheerful child with the disposition of a man who has decided that the world is generally agreeable and intends to proceed on that basis. The Bell Farm in the 1890s was a full and prosperous place. The cotton and cattle operations had reached a scale that required hired hands during the planting and harvest seasons, and the Townsends employed 3 regular hands year-round, 2 of whom had built small houses on the property's northern edge with Amos's encouragement and lumber, which made for more stability than seasonal work. One of the hands was a man named Roberto Garza, who had come up from South Texas and knew more about cattle than anyone Amos had ever met, and who had become, over 5 years, as much a fixture of the farm as the pecan grove. Roberto Garza had a wife, Elena, who came to the farm in 1892 and immediately became Theresa's closest friend in the way that geography sometimes creates. Two women on the same piece of land finding they had more in common than their different backgrounds would suggest. Elena Garza spoke her own mind with the same lack of ceremony that Theresa did, and they worked alongside each other in the kitchen and the garden and the canning shed with the comfortable efficiency of people who have found their equilibrium. The inequality of the time did not escape Amos's notice. The Garzas and the other Mexican families in the area faced a quality of treatment from some of the Anglo population that Amos found troubling, a casual dismissal that he had been quietly pushing back against since he was old enough to recognize it for what it was. The land system in Texas, the way titles had been disputed, and sometimes simply taken in the generation before his, had left scars that were still fresh. He made sure Roberto Garza was paid the same wage as the other hands, and he made sure the small houses on the property's edge were built to the same standard as houses built for anyone else. And he said, when the subject came up in Crossfield over the years, that a man's work was what mattered, and that the rest was foolishness at best and wickedness at worst. He said this without particular drama, in the direct way he said things, and some men agreed and some did not, and Amos did not change his practice based on which men did which. Theresa held the same position, with the same directness, and was in fact more vocal about it than Amos in some contexts, particularly when it came to the treatment of Elena Garza in the Crossfield stores, where she had on at least 2 occasions stood beside Elena, and made it entirely clear to the men behind the counters that her friend's business was as good as anyone's and would be treated accordingly. The Crossfield merchants, who valued Theresa's business and respected her manner, had learned to agree. The year 1895 brought the first really hard time since the flood. The summer was dry, viciously dry, the kind of dry that turns the Texas sky white and cracks the ground in wide patterns, and makes the cattle stand in whatever shade they can find with their heads down. The cotton crop failed almost completely. The corn was better but not good. The cattle kept their weight but not much more. Amos and Caleb and Roberto worked through that summer with the focused grimness of people who have had good years and know that bad years are part of the bargain. The savings from the good years were substantial enough that the farm was not in danger, but it was a year of careful decisions and reduced spending and making do with what was on hand. What Amos remembered most about that summer was the evenings. The children were old enough that summer, Franklin 9, Margaret 7, James almost 2, to be companions rather than simply dependents, and after supper when the heat had backed off slightly, Amos and Theresa and sometimes Caleb would sit on the porch with the children, and there would be conversation and stories, and the particular ease of a family that knows its way around hard times and does not compound them with fear. Theresa had a habit, on difficult evenings, of telling stories about her mother. Not sad stories, or not only sad stories, but stories that showed Margaret Bell as a woman of humor and resource, the kind of woman who had once made a dress from a flour sack and wore it to a dance and danced in it until she wore the soles of her shoes thin. The children listened to these stories with the attention children give to things that matter, and Franklin in particular had a way of asking follow-up questions that kept the stories going longer than they might have otherwise. The drought broke in late September of 1895, and the fall rains came, and the following year was good. The farm recovered its equilibrium. Amos added a second bull and expanded the cattle herd to 50 head, which Roberto managed with the quiet competence that characterized everything he did, and by 1897, the cattle operation was producing enough consistent income that a bad cotton year would not threaten the farm's stability. Franklin Townsend, at 11 years old, had the quality of a person who is already largely himself, already containing the adult he will become. He was his mother's son in his directness and his father's in his patience, and he had, by 11, decided that he was going to study law when he was old enough, which he announced to the family over supper one evening with the certainty of someone reporting a fact rather than stating an ambition. Theresa had looked at Amos across the table, and Amos had looked back at her with the slight widening of the eyes that was his version of smiling without smiling. And he had told Franklin that was a fine ambition, and that law required mathematics, and Franklin had said he was already good at mathematics, which was true. Margaret, at 8 and 9 and 10, had the quality of a child who is taking very good notes. She watched everything with those assessing eyes, the ones she had arrived with, and she asked questions that were specific and serious and sometimes caught adults in the minor inconsistencies of their stated principles, which she did without malice but with complete integrity. By 10 she had decided she wanted to be a teacher, which she had arrived at by the logic that the things she most enjoyed doing were reading and explaining things she had read, and a teacher was someone who did both of those things professionally. James Townsend, growing out of his early round-faced cheerfulness into a rangy, easy-going boy, was the one who loved the land the most in the way his father had when his father was working towards something. He was the one who wanted to be outside in all weather, who followed Roberto Garza through the cattle work with the same intensity his brother had once applied to following Amos, who could identify every sound the river made at every season and what it meant. By 12 he had quietly decided he was going to stay on the farm, which no one had asked him to decide, and which no one had pressured him toward, but which seemed to everyone who knew him to be the most natural possible outcome. Theresa Bell had a stroke in the winter of 1898, a mild one that left him with a slight tremor in his left hand, but no lasting damage to his speech or thinking. Dr. Haverson, who was still practicing at 72 on the principle that retirement was an unnatural state, told him to rest more and smoke less, and to stop lifting things heavier than a coffee cup for the next 2 months. Caleb had received this advice with the expression of a man who has been told something he will interpret in the most convenient possible way. Amos had, after the stroke, increased his own share of the physical farm work in ways that distributed the load more fairly without making Caleb feel displaced. It was a careful calibration, the kind that required understanding the man involved, and Amos understood Caleb Bell well enough by 1898 to navigate it without offense. Caleb Bell was 60 years old and had worked the land his whole life, and the work was his identity in the way that some men's identities are built on work and nothing else, and taking it away would have done more damage than the stroke. So Amos did not take the work away. He added himself to it, and Roberto increased his share, and between the three of them and the regular hands, the farm's operations continued without the kind of gap that would have told Caleb he was no longer essential. Because he was essential, and Amos made sure the operations reflected that. In the spring of 1900, Amos Townsend turned 45. It was not an occasion he would have marked himself, but Theresa organized a gathering at the farmhouse that encompassed both sides of the river, which was by now a boundary without much practical significance, the ford having been widened and reinforced twice more over the years, and the Crossfield Bell crossing connection being simply the ordinary geography of the area. Clara came down from Lubbock with Henry and their 3 children. Tom Whitfield came with his wife and their daughter. Roberto and Elena Garza were there. The Haverson family, the Pattersons, the newer families who had come to the area in the railroad years. Sheriff Pruitt's successor, a calm and thoughtful man named Daniel Reeves who had none of Pruitt's showmanship and considerably more of his effectiveness. Theresa had made a cake from a recipe of her mother's that she had been saving for significant occasions, a chocolate cake with a sweetness that was not overwhelming but was profound, and she put it in front of Amos at the table and said, 45 years. I got the last 20 of them, which I consider the better part. You got the good half, he agreed. The flood half, she said, with the private weight of the phrase that had become their shorthand for the turning point. "The flood half," he said. He looked around the table at the people assembled, at his children, Franklin 19, and already corresponding with a law school in Austin, that his Crossfield teacher Mr. Collins had written to on his behalf, Margaret 17 with her mother's directness, and her own particular sharp-edged warmth, James 14 with his outdoorsman's quiet and his deep attachment to the land outside the window. He looked at Calloway Bell across the table, 62, and still carrying his share of the world with the deliberate strength that had always characterized him. He looked at Clara Marsh and thought about the girl Clara had been when he first knew the Bell family, the one who spent more time reading than working, now a mother of 3 and a woman of the world in her own right. He looked at Roberto and Elena Garza and thought about what they had added to this place and this life. And then he looked at Theresa, who was watching him from her seat beside him with that particular expression she had, the one that was all attention and warmth, and the deep knowledge of a person well and truly known. He covered her hand with his on the table. "Good half," he said again quietly to her. "Getting better," she said. The years turned. Franklin went to Austin for law school in 1901 and wrote letters home on a regularity that Theresa kept, every letter in a wooden box that had been her mother's, a growing archive of her son's development from student to lawyer to man with opinions about things that mattered. He came home for every Christmas and most summers, and each time he came back he had grown more into his own, his mother's green eyes and his father's careful way, with words combining in a person who was going to be very good at arguing in courts of law. Margaret Townsend got her teaching certificate in 1902 from the Normal School in Abilene and came back to the Crossfield area to take the position at the school that Mr. Collins, who had retired at 68, vacated. She was 23 and the youngest teacher the Crossfield school had employed, and some parents had expressed reservations that a young woman of 23 could manage a schoolroom of children ranging from 6 to 15. Margaret Townsend had managed the schoolroom with the same authority she had been bringing to every room she walked into since she was 6 years old, and within a semester the reservations had been replaced by something closer to respect, and in some cases something closer to fear, which Margaret did not discourage because a teacher who cannot command a room is a teacher with a very hard life. She married in 1905, a man named Daniel Lowe who taught at the school in the neighboring town of Porter, and who had met Margaret at a regional education gathering, and had the considerable good sense to recognize immediately what he was looking at and pursue it with every bit of intelligence he possessed. He was 26 to her 23, a dark-haired, thoughtful man from a Louisiana family who had come west with his own determination to build something, and Amos had liked him from the first evening Margaret brought him home because he had opinions, and argued them clearly but was genuinely interested in being wrong, which was the quality Amos considered most important in anyone's character. They married in the Crossfield church, the same church where Amos and Theresa had married 20 years before. Theresa cried, which was a thing she did with great selectivity, and Amos held her hand through the ceremony with the same hand that had covered hers at his 45th birthday table. James Townsend, true to his quiet early decision, stayed on the farm. He took over the cattle operation from Roberto Garza in 1905, when Roberto and Elena announced they were going back to South Texas to be near Elena's aging parents, a departure that was entirely right but that left a gap in the farm's daily life that took time to fill. James filled it by becoming, at 19, the primary cattleman of the Townsend Bell operation, with the combination of Roberto's training and his own lifelong observation. He married in 1906, a girl from a farm 12 miles west named Sarah Deaver, 20 years old and solid as the land she came from, with brown eyes and practical hands, and a disposition toward directness that reminded Amos of Theresa at that age, though he had the wisdom not to say this out loud where either woman could hear it. James brought Sarah to the farm, and she took to the land and the house with the efficiency of someone who had always intended to be somewhere like this, and was simply relieved to have arrived. Caleb Bell died in the winter of 1907, on a cold morning in January, in the bedroom he had slept in his whole life, having never in 69 years felt the need to sleep anywhere else. He had been declining since the previous summer, the heart gradually unwilling to keep up its work, and Dr. Haverson's son, who had taken over his father's practice, had said quietly in October that it was a matter of time and not much of it. Caleb had known and had made his arrangements and had continued to be as much himself as his body would allow, which was more self than most men managed at the end. Amos sat with him the night before he died, in the chair by the bed, the lamp turned low. They had talked a little in the early evening and then sat in silence when talking became too much, and the silence was the comfortable kind that comes only between people who have nothing left to prove to each other. At some point in the night, Caleb Bell had said, "You were good for this place." Amos had said, "You and your father built what was good here. I just came along." "You crossed that damn river," Caleb said, which was the most explicit reference he had ever made to the events of April 1885, and which contained within it everything he had never said directly about what Amos Townsend meant to this family. And then he had closed his eyes, and in the morning he was gone. They buried him in the small Bell family plot on the eastern edge of the farm, beside his parents Franklin and Margaret, under a cedar tree that dropped its fine gray-green fronds over the stones in every season. The Crossfield community came out in the January cold to pay respects, because Caleb Bell had been on this land his whole life, and the land was part of everyone's landscape, and a man who belongs to his land belongs, in some way, to the people of that land's community too. Theresa stood at the grave and was steady, the way she was always steady in public grief, and Amos stood beside her and held her hand, and after everyone had gone back to the farmhouse for the food that communities bring and the warmth that is the living response to loss, they stood alone at the grave for a few minutes more. "He was a good man," Amos said. "He was," she said. "He was better than he ever let on." "He let on more than he thought he did," Amos said. She leaned her head against his arm. "Thank you for sitting with him." "He would have done the same for me," Amos said, which was the simple truth. The farm moved into 1908 and 1909 with the continuity of a living thing. James and Sarah Townsend were expecting their first child, which arrived in June of 1908, a boy they called Robert, after Roberto Garza, which Elena Garza received in a letter with the kind of joy that is beyond ordinary gratitude. A second child followed in 1910, a girl named Bell, for the family name that was now the second half of the farm's name, a small continuity that James had proposed, and Sarah had agreed to with immediate warmth. Franklin Townsend had established himself in Austin as a lawyer of growing reputation, specializing in land rights, which was not an accidental specialization for a man who had grown up on bottomland that had been in his mother's family for 3 generations, and who had seen what it meant to have clear title and what it cost when the title was disputed. He wrote home that he had met a woman named Rose Alcott, a schoolteacher originally from Virginia, and in 1909 he brought her home to the farm, and she and Theresa sat on the porch for 3 hours the first afternoon while the men were elsewhere. And when Amos came in from the fields, Theresa had the particular look of a woman who has taken full measure of someone and found them good. Franklin and Rose married in 1910 in Austin, with a ceremony that Amos and Theresa made the train journey for, their first time on a train, which Amos found interesting and Theresa found extraordinary, watching the Texas landscape unspool past the window with the same assessing attention she brought to everything. Amos Townsend was 55 years old when the decade turned to 1910. He was gray at the temples, and he moved through the farm work with the particular efficiency of a man who has been doing the same work for 25 years and knows every shortcut and every difficulty. The livery in Crossfield had evolved with the times. the automobile having begun to appear in the area in the last couple of years, strange and loud and smelling wrong but undeniably present. And Tom Whitfield's son, who had grown up in the business, was already talking about adding repair services for the new machines, which Amos had agreed to because he was not a man who refused to see what was coming. The Calloway River in these years was familiar to him the way a long-known person is familiar, in all its moods and seasons. He crossed the ford so many times it had become entirely unconscious, the way you move through spaces you know completely. But every so often, standing at the edge of the ford in the evening with the water clear around the horse's feet, he would catch a particular angle of the light, the way it fell on the Crossfield bank, and he would remember being on that bank looking across, and he would feel the weight of what had been and what was, the 7 years and the flood, and the 25 years of marriage, and the children and the farm and the grave under the cedar tree. And it would consolidate for a moment into something he couldn't quite name, but that was entirely sufficient. Theresa found him one evening, in the fall of 1910, standing at the river's edge in exactly this way. She had come down to the ford to call him in for supper and had found him standing there in the amber light, looking at the Crossfield side with an expression she recognized from a long time ago. "What are you seeing?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "Old country," he said. She looked at the western bank, at the Crossfield roof lines through the trees, at the road along which he had walked for years watching the other direction. "Does it look different now?" "Very different," he said. "From here, from this side, it looks like a place I used to live." He turned to look at the farmhouse behind them, the windows lit, the smoke from the kitchen already starting up, James and Sarah's voices somewhere near the barn. "This is where I live." She slipped her hand into his arm the way she had done on the porch bench decades ago. "7 years you were over there," she said. "7 years," he agreed. "And then a flood," she said. "And then a flood," he said. "Amos Townsend," she said, with the same quality as the first time she had called his name across the water, the quality of something held and then released, though now it was not fear but something that had no exact name in the ordinary language of things, some compound of gratitude and love and time, and the specific river-scented evening air of this particular bottomland. "Yes," he said, which was the answer to a question she had not asked, or perhaps had been asking for 25 years. They stood at the river's edge in the fall light until the supper call came again from the farmhouse, James's voice this time, carrying across the yard with the particular pitch of a man calling people he loves, and then they turned together and walked up from the water toward the lit windows. The years after 1910 moved with the accumulated weight of a settled life, which is not the same as a static life. There was always something happening in the specific way that a farm's life is always happening, the calving and planting and harvesting and repairing, and the small emergencies, and the good seasons and the hard ones. There was the generation below them growing up, Robert and Belle Townsend at the farm, Franklin and Rose's children arriving in Austin where Amos and Theresa visited once a year by train, Margaret and Daniel Lowe's children growing up in Porter and coming to the farm for summers. Sarah Townsend had a third child in 1912, another boy they called Amos, which was James's idea, and which Amos had received with the particular discomfort of a man who is not used to having things named after him, and which Theresa had received with the unambiguous satisfaction of a woman who thinks it is entirely appropriate. Theresa Bell Townsend at 50 years old was not the same person as Theresa Bell at 20, but she was continuous with her, in the way a river is continuous with its source. The green eyes were the same, and the directness, and the habit of assessment and the laugh. She had gray coming into her dark hair, which she wore in a braid that was now more silver than black in the mornings when she first came into the kitchen, and Amos had told her on a morning in 1913 that it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in 28 years of mornings, which she had received with a look that said she thought he was being ridiculous and also meant it. She had outlived her brother and her father and her mother, and the farm had outlived all its bad years, and she had 3 living children and 7 grandchildren in various locations around Texas, and one more apparently on the way in Austin. And she had a husband who had crossed a flooded river to get to her, and had not once suggested that he regretted the crossing. In the summer of 1913, Amos sold the Crossfield livery. He sold it to Tom Whitfield's son, who had been running it in all practical senses for years, and who wanted it with the particular want of someone who has earned a thing, and is finally being given the formal version of what was already true. The money went into the farm, into a second cattle barn that James had been wanting for 2 years, into a new well on the north side of the property, into the education fund that Amos and Theresa maintained for their grandchildren. With the livery gone, Amos crossed the ford to Crossfield perhaps twice a week instead of every day, and the crossing became entirely recreational rather than vocational. He went to town for supplies and for the pleasure of talking to the people he had known for 35 years, people who remembered him as a livery hand from San Antonio and now knew him as a man of property and family, and one of the fixed points of the community's geography. He was sitting on the porch on an evening in September of 1913, having just come back from one of these town visits, when Theresa came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him, and said, with the directness that was always hers, "I am very happy, Amos." He had taken his coffee cup and looked at her. The evening was warm and the pecan trees were heavy with the fall nuts, and the river was visible in the distance, carrying the last of the day's light on its surface. "Good," he said. "So am I want to say it sometimes," she said. "So it's said out loud, so it's in the air." "I understand that," he said. "I was happy before," she said. "But this is a different kind of happy, the kind that has a long history behind it," he nodded. "The kind that has crossed a river and built a house and raised children and buried beloved people and worked land through drought and flood and good seasons and hard ones and is still, on a September evening with coffee, satisfied. 7 years I watched you from across that river," she said, "before you came across." "I know," he said. "I was watching back," she said. "I should tell you that. I was watching back." He turned to look at her. "I know," he said again. "I think I always knew. You could have come sooner," she said with the old teasing edge. "You could have called across," he said. She laughed. "I suppose I could have," she said. "It's what I did in the flood." "It was a very persuasive method," he said. She reached over and covered his hand with hers, reversing the gesture he had made at the birthday table 13 years ago, and they sat on the porch of the Bell farmhouse, which was now the Townsend Bell farmhouse, on a September evening in 1913, with their grandchildren's voices carrying from inside the house, where James and Sarah's Robert and Belle were doing whatever children do in the long last light of summer's end, and the Calloway River made its sound in the distance, carrying everything that fell into it in both directions, the flood water and the clear water alike, not distinguishing between them, just moving them all along together toward whatever came next. The farm was a good farm. Their life was a good life. The river was the same river it had always been, and they were on the same side of it and had been for 28 years, and would be for as many years as were given to them, which they intended would be many. Amos Townsend, who had loved Theresa Bell from across the river for 7 years before the flood gave him a reason to cross, held his wife's hand on the porch of their home in the September evening, and thought that he had been, in the end, a very fortunate man. Not lucky exactly, because luck was arbitrary, and what he had was the result of a particular morning with a raft and a screaming woman he loved, and a river so high it would knock a horse down, and the decision, made before thought could interfere with it, to go anyway. He had gone anyway. The river had tried to take him sideways, and he had pushed against it with a 12-foot pole, and the stubbornness of a man who cannot not cross when something he loves is on the other side. And the rest of it, the 28 years of the rest of it, had been everything. The coffee went cold in their cups because neither of them moved to drink it. The evening came down around the farmhouse and the pecan trees and the bottomland fields and the river, and the lights came on in the windows, and from inside came the sound of children and food and ordinary life continuing its extraordinary business. And Amos and Theresa sat in the middle of all of it, at the center of the life they had made from one flood and 7 years of watching and one man's willingness to finally, fully cross.